Keddie, California. A resort town so quiet, people remember the sound of footsteps. In April of 1981, Keddie was the kind of place where night settled gently. Cabins stood close together. Windows glowed softly. Voices carried. And that's why what happened inside one small vacation cabin still feels impossible. On the night of April 11th, 1981, inside a one-room cabin tucked into the trees, 4 people were attacked with such violence that it should have torn through the night. It didn't. No screams reported, no frantic knocks, no neighbors calling police, no forced entry. And by morning, 4 people were dead. 1 child was gone, and the evidence had already begun to slip away. Keddie sits in the mountains of Northern California, surrounded by the dense woods of Plumas National Forest. It began as a railroad town. It became a seasonal retreat. Families rented cabins. Kids rode bikes between them. Paths crossed. Walls were thin. Cabin 28 was not remote. It wasn't hidden. It sat among other cabins, within earshot of neighbors. This was not the kind of place where something terrible could happen quietly. And yet, sometime after night fell, someone entered Cabin 28 without forcing a door or breaking a window. They came in calmly enough that no one heard it, and they stayed long enough to change everything. Sue Sharp was 36 years old. She had left an abusive marriage on the East Coast and brought her children west, hoping distance might offer safety. Living with her in Cabin 28 were 3 of her children. John Sharp, 15, quiet, artistic, protective of his sisters. Tina Sharp, 12, shy, thoughtful, known for keeping to herself. Sheila Sharp, 14, spending that night next door with friends. That evening, Dana Wingate, 17, stayed over. John's friend. A normal teenage sleepover. 5 children, 1 mother. Nothing about the night suggested danger. No one reported an argument. No one heard raised voices. No one saw strangers coming or going. The cabin lights went out, and the forest closed in. At 7:45 the next morning, Sheila Sharp walked back to Cabin 28. She opened the door and stepped into silence. Inside the living room, she saw her mother, her brother, her friend. They were bound with electrical wire and medical tape, beaten with a hammer, stabbed repeatedly. The violence was extreme, but investigators would later describe it with a word that feels wrong: controlled. There were no overturned tables, no shattered furniture, no sign of a frantic struggle racing through the cabin. And one detail overshadowed everything else. Tina wasn't there. From the beginning, Cabin 28 refused to behave like a crime scene born of rage. There was no forced entry. Curtains were drawn. Some victims showed little evidence of defensive wounds. A bent steak knife was found nearby. A hammer lay in the room. And then investigators noticed something else. Blood was present, but unevenly. Heavy in some areas, wiped away in others. Certain surfaces appeared partially cleaned, while nearby areas were untouched. This wasn't a hurried escape. It suggested time, comfort, familiarity with the space, and an understanding of what mattered and what didn't. 4 people were attacked with knives and blunt force. So why did no one hear screaming? The answer likely lies in how the violence began. Investigators believe the victims were restrained early. Electrical wire, medical tape. A hammer may have been used first, not to kill, but to incapacitate. A sudden blow can steal breath, consciousness, sound. When control comes before chaos, noise never gets a chance to grow. Cabin 28 was carpeted. Soft furnishings absorbed sound. Windows were closed, curtains drawn. Outside, the forest did the rest. Wind in the trees, a nearby creek, the normal sounds of night. Silence wasn't proof that nothing happened. It was proof the attack was designed to stay quiet. Stabbings usually leave trails, bloody footprints, smears, panic written into the floor. Cabin 28 didn't. Blood pooled near the victims but didn't travel far. That tells investigators something critical. There wasn't frantic movement. No one ran through the cabin. No one fled barefoot in terror. The violence stayed contained. Carpet absorbs blood downward, not outward. Footwear on hard-packed paths outside wouldn't record impressions. And gloves, simple, ordinary gloves, erase fingerprints entirely. This wasn't forensic genius. It was basic awareness, the kind that comes from experience or preparation. Crimes of passion leave mess. They spill outward. They break things. They create noise and mistakes. What happened in Cabin 28 did the opposite. Control came first. Violence followed. Silence remained. Someone knew how to keep the room quiet, how to limit movement, how to leave without being remembered. That doesn't mean the killer was a professional. It means they understood crime scenes well enough to avoid creating one that talked back. By the time the violence inside Cabin 28 ended, 3 people were dead, and 1 bed was empty. Tina Sharp was gone. There was no blood tying her injuries to the cabin. No sign she died there at all. Which means something happened after the murders were already over. A decision. For most crimes, that's where the story ends. But in Keddie, that's where it truly begins. When investigators reconstructed the night inside Cabin 28, one fact refused to settle. The violence had ended. The room was quiet. The risk had been managed. And yet, someone made another decision. Tina Sharp was gone. Not hidden. Not left behind. Removed. There was no blood inside the cabin tying her injuries to that room. Which means whatever happened to Tina happened later, after the others were already dead. Search teams combed the area around Keddie. Dogs, volunteers, law enforcement. They found no footprints leading into the forest. No signs of a struggle outside the cabin. No witnesses who saw a child being taken. No ransom demand followed. No phone calls, no letters. Tina Sharp simply vanished into the trees. For 3 years, her disappearance became its own cold case. Until 1984. In a remote area near Feather Falls, hikers came across human remains. They were identified as Tina Sharp, 30 miles from Cabin 28, far enough that her death could not be dismissed as a panic dumping of a body, far enough to require intention. Her remains confirmed what investigators already feared. Tina had not been killed in the cabin. She had been taken somewhere else. The most common explanation is the simplest, that Tina saw something, that she woke up during the attack, recognized a voice, saw a face. Under this theory, Tina became a liability, someone who could identify the killer, and removing her eliminated that risk. It's a theory that makes sense on the surface, but it fractures when followed to its logical end. If Tina was only a witness, there was no need to take her. The cabin was dark. The killers were already committed. Killing her there would have been faster, quieter, safer. Transporting a witness only increases risk, unless something else was at work. This is where the most controversial interpretation emerges. The idea investigators rarely say out loud, that Tina wasn't collateral, that she wasn't taken because she was inconvenient, but because she was the point. Under this theory, the murders inside cabin 28 were not the end of the crime. They were the means to it. The violence created control, the control created time, and the time allowed one final act to unfold somewhere else, away from witnesses, away from the cabin, away from interruption. This would mean the crime didn't happen all at once. It happened in phases. And Tina's death was always meant to happen somewhere else. If panic ruled the night, Tina would have been left behind. Instead, someone carried her out of the cabin, past other cabins, onto familiar paths, into the forest. That requires calm, it requires confidence, and it requires a belief that no one would stop them. This wasn't improvisation, it was follow-through. The brutality, the removal of a child, the separation of the crime. These details invite a dangerous question. Was this the work of a serial killer? Northern California in the late 1970s and early 1980s was not sure on predators. But when investigators searched for patterns, they found none. No similar crimes, no repeated signatures, no escalation. Despite decades of speculation, no serial killer has ever been credibly linked to the Keddie Cabin murders, which makes the reality more disturbing. This appears to have been personal, targeted, singular. Someone who knew enough to plan and enough to stop. The absence of screams, the lack of bloody footprints, the missing fingerprints, the partial cleanup. Together, they tell a story, not of forensic brilliance, but of familiarity. Someone understood how to control victims early, how to limit movement, how sound travels or doesn't, how evidence is created, and how it can be minimized. This doesn't require law enforcement training. It requires experience, or preparation, or confidence built over time. Nearly every unanswered question in this case collapses into a single one. Why Tina? Not why she was killed, why she was taken. If Tina was only a witness, her removal was unnecessary. If Tina was the target, her removal was inevitable. And until that question is answered, the Keddie Cabin murders will never fully make sense. As the investigation unfolded, law enforcement focused on familiar names, men who live nearby, men with violent histories, men who frightened people long before April 1981. The primary suspect was Martin Smart Jr. He had a volatile temper, a history of violence, and according to multiple accounts, he knew Sue Sharp. Smart's close associate, John Leroy Boobed, was also scrutinized. Both men were known to carry knives. Both were known to talk openly about violence. Both were spoken about in town with a kind of quiet fear. And yet, neither was ever charged. As years passed, investigators realized the problem wasn't just what they didn't know. It was what no longer existed. Critical evidence was either lost or destroyed. Lost. The audio confession tapes, portions of police notes, early witness statements, destroyed. Blood-stained items, discarded improperly. The murder weapons, never recovered. Evidence disposed of due to storage issues. When new detectives reopened the case in 2013, they discovered something chilling. Some of the most important evidence had been destroyed years earlier, gone before anyone could question it again. Not everything disappeared. Crime scene photographs remained. Autopsy reports still existed. Basic evidence logs and timelines survived. Messy, yes. Incomplete, absolutely. But present, What vanished shared one trait. It could still speak. Audio, notes, statements, records that could be reinterpreted. Physical evidence degrades. Records don't vanish by accident, not selectively, not repeatedly. Decades later, modern DNA testing was finally applied to what little biological material remained. The results were unsettling. The DNA did not match Martin Smart Jr., and it didn't match anyone in CODIS, which raised only two possibilities. Either an accomplice was never identified, or the killer was never on law enforcement's radar at all. Instead of bringing clarity, DNA made the case colder, because exclusion without identification leaves only absence. In most unsolved cases, evidence disappears randomly. But in the Keddie Cabin Murders, the losses don't feel random. They feel selective. What vanished wasn't the carpet, or the furniture, or the layout of the cabin. What vanished were the things that could still talk years later. This leads to the most controversial theory of all. That evidence wasn't merely mishandled. It was intentionally suppressed to protect someone. Not necessarily someone powerful, just someone whose implication would have created fallout the system wasn't prepared to absorb. In small communities, influence doesn't require a title. Sometimes it's proximity, sometimes it's familiarity, sometimes it's the unspoken understanding that some truths are better left buried. No influential suspect was ever officially identified. There is no signed memo, no blacked out name, no smoking gun pointing to protection. And yet, the scale and selectivity of the evidence loss refuses to be ignored. There is no proof of corruption, but there is proof of selectivity. And selectivity always points to motive. By the time the violence inside Cabin 28 ended, the room was silent. Sue Sharp was dead. John Sharp was dead. Dana Wingate was dead. For most crimes, that's the end. But in Keddie, it wasn't. Because one bed was empty and one child was gone. Nearly every unanswered question returns to Tina Sharp, not because she was the youngest, but because her fate split away from everyone else's. She was taken. And if she was taken because she was targeted, then the worst part of that night didn't happen in Cabin 28. It happened later, somewhere dark, somewhere quiet, where there were no witnesses left at all. Cabin 28 is gone now. The ground where it stood is empty. But the story didn't disappear with it. 4 people were murdered. A child was taken into the woods. Confessions vanished. Evidence was destroyed. And someone walked free. This isn't a mystery because there were no answers. It's a mystery because the answers were lost or taken. Tina wasn't just taken from the scene. She was removed from the story the killers didn't want told. The Keddie Cabin Murders remain unsolved.
Madness and